According to Dr. Ben, the original name of Africa was Alkebulan. Africa, the whole continent, was also called Ethiopia. As a matter of fact, the Atlantic Ocean was called the Ethiopian Sea. So there were several different names. Africa was really described by different tribes. It wasn't a whole monolithic society, but eventually they named Africa after a European.
Africa was not called Africa. It's actually named after the one who actually conquered the Carthaginians, Scipio Africanus. So they usually, the Roman types of system is that the conquering general gets to name the region he conquers. He gets his name to be placed on that region. So Scipio Africanus they named a certain terrain after him. So everybody just said, well, let's call it Africa or Africanus. But if you look to Dr. Ben's work, you'll find that it was called Kush, and you'll find it was called Alkebulan. It had many names: Ethiopia, which is essentially Greek, but a whole continent was once known as Ethiopia.
The most powerful civilizations in the history of the world, ancient Egypt, reigned supreme for more than 3,000 years. Settled around the Nile River in northeast Africa, the ancient Egyptians created huge pyramids, beautiful statues, detailed artwork, and a complex system of hieroglyphic writing. During their long history, they made advances in agriculture, architecture, and astronomy. And the many artifacts they left behind still capture our imaginations today. Before Egypt became an empire, it was divided into two kingdoms, the Upper Kingdom in the south and the Lower Kingdom in the north. These names may seem backwards to us, but they were named after the flow of the Nile River. Was upstream, and the Lower Kingdom was downstream. Around 3100 BC, about 5,000 years ago, a king named Narmer united the two kingdoms, creating an empire that would last thousands of years. To show that the kingdoms were equal, Narmer established a new city between them, Memphis. This unification marked the official beginning of Egypt as a civilization. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt also gave Egypt control of the entire Nile River, and that was a key to its power. Without the Nile, there would have been no Egypt. Northeast Africa is almost completely desert and receives very little rain. In some areas, it may rain only once every few years. The Nile River provided the Egyptians with precious water, but also something else just as important: mud. Every year between June and September, the Nile River overflowed its banks, flooding the land on either side. But this annual flood was not a disaster. The people of Egypt looked forward to it. When the Nile flooded, it covered the fields on both sides with a layer of rich brown mud that could grow wheat, barley, and vegetables. When the river did not flood very much, the people would not be able to grow enough food. The Nile River provided other important resources as well. Mud from the riverbanks was used to make bricks. Papyrus plants growing along its edge were used to make paper, baskets, rope, and sandals. Even the water itself formed a sort of highway, allowing boats to transport people and goods from one end of the kingdom to the other. Because of the Nile, the Egyptians became shipbuilders. Their earliest ships were skiffs, made of bundles of papyrus reeds tied together. Air trapped in the hollow reeds helped these skiffs to float. The Egyptians would use long poles to push these early boats across the river. Later ships were made of wooden planks, with reeds stuffed into the cracks. At first they rowed, but later developed sails to allow the wind to blow their ships up and down the river. With these ships, the ancient Egyptians were able to trade with other countries around the Mediterranean Sea. They also became explorers, traveling as far as the east coast of Africa and crossing the Indian Ocean. The Nile River was so important to the people of ancient Egypt that their calendar was based on it. They divided the year into 3 seasons: inundation, when the Nile would flood; growing, when it was time to plant crops; and harvest.
Concurrently and simultaneously during the Pyramid Age, there are great things happening in West Africa, but we very seldom. There are nations known as Dartichet. Dartichet is now, would geographically presently be located where Ghana is. We had the Nak culture, which is where we today would call Nigeria. We have the Monomotapan Empire in what today we call Zimbabwe. There are over 300 stone structures in southern Africa. And then you have that great structure in the great Zimbabwe that shows a direct relationship to the Grand Lodge of Luxor in Egypt. You have Puanit, which is in today's Somalia, Ethiopia. You have the Kush empires that are simultaneously happening. When Hatshepsut, the great Pharaoh king, although she was a woman, she was a Pharaoh king, sitting on the throne of Kemet, her cousin sits on the throne of Puanit, or what we call Somalia. There are great things happening historically across the African continent. You have the kingdoms of Kuba and Luba in Central Africa.
Mansa Musa was the king of Mali in the 1300s, very wealthy brother. During the dark age of Europe was going through a dark age, Africa was thriving. It was the gold capital. Mansa Musa was considered the wealthiest man on the planet at the time. Mansa Musa had a very well-known pilgrimage to Mecca, where he went to Egypt and went to Mecca and went through Egypt, and he gave out so much gold, it threw off the Egyptian economy. In today's terms, Mansa Musa gave away what would be the equivalent of $100 million in gold.
The African was the first race to circumnavigate the entire globe.
There is only one race on the planet, and that is the human race. And because of biological climatology, this race was born, nurtured, sustained, civilized, educated in Africa. And Dr. Clark teaches us that after they got their show together, then they took it on the road.
Asia in the south. The white man said this. So they often, in ancient times, Asia was considered a part of Africa, or Africa's second civilization. They said that you go to Asia and it's nothing but a carbon copy of Africa because it was settled by the Africans.
A lot of people don't know that there are pyramids all over Asia, and there are pyramids in China. In Japan, they have an underwater pyramid that a lot of people don't know about, and you can go there now, and that's one of those ancient mysteries. But again, pyramids are all over the planet.
The European philosophers, what did they say? They often said that Africa had two great civilizations, Egypt in the north.
You can see the African ancestry in their features.
The Japanese were formed when Ethiopians brought South Koreans onto the island and combined with the original people there known as the Ainu. The Ainu now, you're going to find the Ainu in the Philippines. They're going to be called Negritos. You're going to find them in Vietnam. They're called the Champa or the Montagnards. You're going to find African people throughout the Far East. Very dark complexion, very curly hair, wide nose, thick lip. You will also find those with straight hair. You will find those with a more aquiline nose.
Some of the first Buddha statues clearly had African features, classical African features. If you go to Thailand, if you go to Korea, if you go to Vietnam, you will see some of these statues up that has the classical African nose, classical African lips, woolly hair.
When we go to Asia, we see that the founder of the samurai warrior, okay, in Japan, all right, was an African. We found that the founders of the ninja system was an African. In fact, in Japan, there's a saying that if you don't have a little bit of African blood, you can never truly be a samurai.
Martial arts was established by a black Dravidian who was living in southern India by the name of Bodhidharma. The Bodhidharma, it was said that he walked from southern India into Asia, China, and on his way there, he would study the fighting mechanisms of animals, and he used that as a form of self-defense for himself, and that's where martial arts started. There was another guy named Tigwai who was an original master of martial arts, and if you look at old paintings of Tigwai, this dude looks like Lionel Richie. So martial arts was really established in Africa. Even during slavery in Brazil, there's a form of Brazilian martial arts, which is African martial arts called capoeira. And what they would do, the African slaves would practice this form of martial art, and they would disguise it as dancing.
When we look at the early pictures of most of the deities of Asia, nearly all of them bore striking resemblance to the deity deities of the Nile Valley civilizations. And even in their writings, you will see that even in Asia, not just Greece and Rome, but even in Asia, you see them paying tribute to the spiritual systems and history that they had learned in Africa. In fact, the Asian spiritual system is probably the closest approximate to the traditional African spiritual system. From the one, you get many, with the creator being manifested in all living organisms, be it a tree or a human being. That is fundamental to Asian thought, but it's also fundamental to African thought, which predated Asia.
And another thing about South India, South is, there is a history behind this. The first Aryan invasions happened somewhere between 8,500 to 9,000 years ago. That is when people started coming from across Himalayas to Indian subcontinent. So when they came and saw this place, it was their place, and above all, gold. Gold was like everything. Gold was like simply everywhere. You will see not that long ago, even in recent times, something like 1,500 years ago, travelers who came from outside report gold and diamonds were sold, gold nuggets and diamonds were sold on the street side without any security, without anything, which could not be done anywhere else in the world, because it was so abundant. That is what fired all the European expeditions, you know. All the Columbuses, Vasco da Gamas took off because they heard about the gold and they tasted the spice. So spice and gold, gold spice, you heard that. So the gold was one thing, and another thing was these were settled communities. They had built cities at that time. Because they had established cities, how this happened is just this. These are Aryans who came from outside. They live in harsh lands, so they're nomadic in nature. Because these people here in the indigenous people of India looked at the earth, because of that, thousands of years ago they developed agriculture. They did not know how to travel the seas, but they knew how to get gold out of the land, how to get food out of the land, how to make the land rich and live there. So naturally, they lived in one place. Once they lived in one place, arts, culture, music, mathematics, all kinds of things developed, building crafts, all these things developed and they built cities. When these people did not know what is a city, what is a dwelling, when they lived in tents or slept in open and they were nomadic, when they came and saw this, and because they were always on the move, they were rough men. Because these people had settled down, they kind of softened up. So when they came, they were an easy take. And gradually, as the Aryan hordes came from the north, initially just as like bandits, later on as settlers, later on as conquerors, gradually step by step, in the next 2,000 to 3,000 years, this happened. When this happened, gradually they pushed these people down, pushed these people down. They pushed them south and pushed them south. You will see this if you just look at the people. It'll be not nice, but if you ask people from the base southeast Tamil Nadu, somebody from Karnataka, somebody from Andhra Pradesh, somebody from Madhya Pradesh, somebody from Maharashtra, somebody further up, further up, further up, you will see the color of the skin, the physical stature, how it changes. Because this is how people were, the two cultures met, intermingled, and this became one way. The really up north looked different, and even today it looks different. So because of this, whatever came from the Aryan culture, a small group of diehards resisted that. Even today they resist it, okay? Even today, all the political parties in Tamil Nadu have to have the affix that it's Dravidian. Always they're Dravidian parties, otherwise there's no way they can come to political power, because still that feeling and that emotion is still strong in people. and they may not know the history, but they know somewhere some exploitation happened to them. See, keeping people ignorant is not a solution. So, because of this, there is a resistance of cultural imposition in the form of Ramayana, Mahabharata, and if you look at it, there is a streak of prejudice running through Ramayana and Mahabharata. They're dismissing of the indigenous people as Rakshasas, and they're saying killing them is not even a crime, you can burn them down. See, the way Kunti burned down that mother and 5 sons, there is not even a thought about it because they're Nishada people. That means they're not Aryans. A non-Aryan person, if you burn him, it means nothing. I'm saying it has been so in many parts of the world, isn't it? If you killed a black man in America, let us say 100 years ago, it was not a crime, it was just a social event, you know. So it was so here also, but a few thousand years ago. So this was there, so because of this feeling, still there is a small little bit of resistance going on about that.
Migrated from Africa to Europe between 40 and 60,000 years ago. And in the process of evolution, many of them lost the Africoid genotype and phenotypical features and then went on to look.
The origin of the name Europe comes from a Phoenician goddess named Europa. So the origin of the name Europe has an African origin because the Phoenicians, we're still dealing with black African people, the Canaanites and all that. When we talk about Phoenicians, we're still talking about black folks.
The first Europeans were a group of Africans called the Grimaldi who had migrated from Africa to Europe between 40 and 60,000 years ago. And in the process of evolution, many of them lost the Africoid genotype and phenotypical features and then went on to look more European-esque. You even see in pre-racist Europe, Africans and Europeans living side by side. In fact, a lot of European families have an African background that they don't like to acknowledge.
Queen Charlotte, she was a woman of African descent, and this is well known throughout Europe. There was another guy, King Charles. Many people say that he has an African origin as well, that he has African ancestry. King Charles was referred to as the black boy growing up because he was so dark. And they have pubs over in Europe now called the Black Boy Pub or the Black Boy Inn, which refers to King Charles. There's also knowledge about King Charles being a descendant of the De Medici family. The De Medici family out of Europe, out of Italy, they're known to have that African bloodline as well. One of the De Medicis, Alessandro De Medici, who was a ruler in Italy, you look at pictures of him, this dude looks like Ryan Leslie. So you could see that African bloodline running through a lot of these people of royal descent. There were blacks in Scotland. There was one black Scottish king named Kenneth the Dub. There are figurines and carvings of black Scots.
The Celtic Druids was the African priesthood that had gone into Europe and had inhabited the islands of what we today call Ireland, inhabited what we today call so-called Great Britain, Scotland, and Wales. It inhabited Holland, inhabited Denmark, was all up in there.
Many Greeks and Romans were biracial, to use a modern term, which they didn't use back then. They were biracial. Their look, okay, could not readily on the surface be absolutely identified as European or black because many of them was of a biracial stock.
Hannibal Barca, the great military genius, he comes from an African background. In a lot of movies and on television shows, they will try to Europeanize and whiten up the image of Hannibal Barca, but he was definitely a man of African descent. There are even coins throughout Europe and North Africa of Hannibal showing him. Many historians say that there's a coin of a black man and there's an elephant on the other side, and people say that that is Hannibal.
Yes, Hannibal Barcas was one of the greatest warriors that ever lived. And what he did, what he accomplished, is now still a matter of study in all of the world's military colleges. What he did by bringing together, he had the power to bring different factions together. He had different, the Celts, he had the African horsemen, he had different types of armies. So when he went against Rome, they didn't know who to fight because there were so many different styles of warfare. And when you had such a genius and a brilliant man at 22, actually orchestrating after his father, of course, taught him everything that he knew, brought him on campaigns to teach him, he came back and actually took his father's genius to the next level. Septimus Severus was African, and he was the one that actually took the fight, took the Roman fight up north into England.
The Russian language that we know today can be attributed to a black man named Alexander Pushkin. He created the modern Russian language because they were speaking French and other types of language there.
Had it not been for someone like Alexander Pushkin, Russians would be speaking French today.
A lot of people say that people like Leonardo da Vinci and Sir Isaac Newton, they created a lot of inventions in Europe, but a lot of their inventions can be attributed to the African presence that was in Europe because there was a strong African presence and they were bringing in science and mathematics, so that's where all that came from.
Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, you know, all of them studied with African people. They didn't come up with this. And when people talk about Leonardo da Vinci, the only question that I have as it relates to Leonardo da Vinci is who was his teacher? Who taught Leonardo da Vinci brain anatomy? Who taught him about the airplane? Who taught him this? Tell me who was his teacher. They can't tell you who the teacher is because if they told you who the teacher is, they would have to tell you they were black.
Marco Polo, he was considered to be one of the first Europeans to make it over into Eastern Asia. And what Marco Polo did, he took something known as the Silk Road into Asia. And the Silk Road was already established by Africans and other Aboriginal people. And the Silk Road, they would travel this road and they would trade garments. And this is why Italy has always been known to be a fashion mecca. People always talk about the quality of Italian clothes, but when we talk about Italian fashion, where did they get that fashion sense from? See, the Italians got that fashion sense from the Moors and the Africans that went in there. They brought those silk garments and all those fly clothes into Europe. Even the concept of alligator shoes, which is attributed to Italy, the thing is, alligators are not indigenous to Italy. Crocodiles are not indigenous to Italy. So where did they get those alligator skins and those crocodile skins? They got those from Africa. The Moors brought that in. And the players wear shoes called Maori Gators. Those are some of the most popular shoes around among players, the Maori Gators. The word Maori is a variation of the word Moorish. So we have to know all this stuff. All that is our stuff. That's African stuff.
When you look at some of the great European artists, okay, Van Gogh and all of these types of guys, you will see a lot of their art was inspired by the so-called dark art of West Africa. There has been studies that have put the pieces of Van Gogh and others up next to pieces of traditional African cultural art in West Africa. That art that would be considered a negative, underworldly, dark and demonic. But the great European artists copied what was considered by Europe some of the lowest and most primitive forms of artwork that went on to be considered some of the most successful by them.
Suleiman taught Mozart. Who's Suleiman? Suleiman's a Moor. He's an African. Who is Beethoven? Beethoven was Thoven Bey. He was a Moor.
His mother was a Moor. Yes. And when he went deaf, that melanin kicked in. The inner eye kicked in. He heard music better when he was deaf than he heard it otherwise.
There's a book about him called Beethoven's Hair because people were so infatuated with the texture of his hair. So that African bloodline runs real deep throughout Europe. And again, he was called a Moor, and the Moors were very important throughout Europe. And it's funny, the importance of the Moor was so deep in Europe, but we rarely hear about them in history books today.
You see reference to Moors throughout African history. You see reference to Moors over here in American history.
The Moors were African men who went into Europe around 711 AD, and they really civilized Europe because Europe was going through a dark age. Europe was really struggling because after the Vandals had basically destroyed Rome, everything was backwards over there. So the Moors went in and they ushered in the Renaissance era. They brought in science, mathematics, astrology. They brought all of this into Europe.
They are bringing in hot and cold running water. They are bringing in concepts of what we call a cosmopolitan city. They are lighting the streets by lamps. In Cordova, you know, they built an entire city where the streets for miles you could walk with lamps that lit the street at night. And they had raised sidewalks where people could walk. The kings and queens of Europe lived in barns. Nobody wants to admit that. But they lived in barns. They lived with the animals. And another thing that the Africans brought in was that they said, you know, you cannot let your chicken run around in your house, and them cows got to go outside. So they created what's called corrals. And corral is an Ethiopian word. It's a K-R-A-L sound. Corral, which is where they would put their animals after they domesticated them. Europeans let them animals run all up and down. This is where the German measles come from. This is where chickenpox come from. Because Europeans did not have a place for their animals. They just ran all up inside their places. And they would carry, as they would get illnesses and sicknesses, they did not bathe, so therefore they had no soap, they had no disinfectant, didn't have alcohol, so that this type of style of living brought illness. When the Moors came in, they wrapped all that up, along with bringing medicine. What you have happening is that these Gothic kingdoms are going to bring down, they're going to sack the Roman Empire. And after they sack the Roman Empire, they're going to take this area over for a while. And then the Moors are going to come in and they're going to push those Visigoths out. And they're going to push them more north, and they're going to chase them out of the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula. And that's where the Moors are going to inhabit from 710 until 1492, January 2nd to be exact, when the last great king, Boabdil, was chased out of Granada.
The term Moor started to become interchangeable with the term black, because it was basically the same thing. But when the slave trade started, they tried to objectify black people, Moorish people. So they would use the term interchangeably, and they would just switch on to calling people black. But if you look at a lot of old documents, there's even slave ships called Blackamoor. If you look at slave records, there was even a boxer out of Virginia who was very popular in the early 1800s named Tom Molyneux, and his nickname was the Moor. So that name was definitely used interchangeably with black or Negro at that time.
Moor means black. Like Negro, Ethiopian. Moor means black. Moor is not a people. Moor is a color. And they have taken this word Moor and they have associated Moor with Muslim. There were Moors that weren't Muslim. Moor means black. There were Christian Moors. There were Moors that practiced a traditional African faith system. So that Moor means black, simple.
When the Moors went into Europe, they changed the appearance of the population. Do you see? So you have Italians, Spaniards being darker than the Scandinavians. A Scandinavian person told me that they never considered the Italians or Jewish people to be white. Do you see? Because the lighter people are further north.
And that the Moors brought in this knowledge into Europe. Africans brought this knowledge into Europe. And in bringing this knowledge into Europe, the Knights Templars and other organizations were born out of this. And peoples of European descent were exposed to alchemy. Okay, the periodic table of elements, the laboratory, how to take information, how to take elements and atoms, and to begin to manipulate them to make them into different types of molecules. The basic one is hydrogen, 2 hydrogen is helium, 3 hydrogen is lithium, 6 is carbon, 8 is oxygen. So you have this alchemy that's going to come, and they're going to begin to study, they're going to begin to learn, they're going to create societies that's going to develop an understanding. This is going to be what eventually is going to become Freemasonry, because only a select group of people in Europe is going to be exposed to this information. What we today call Islam, Arabic didn't exist. Arabic was the language of the Quran, and that came out of Africans. That Spanish and French and Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, these languages would codify themselves. Once the Moors came in and brought civilization and brought in a semblance of language and syntax, they then would take Latin and they would branch off, and then you would have Spanish. That's why all of the languages are related to Latin. That's why they call the Latin languages.
A lot of the European royal family's coat of arms, you can clearly see depictions of Moors. Many of the original castles of Europe were built by the Moors. There are many Moorish castles in Spain, Italy, England, And some of these castles, they can be seen in Africa as well. A lot of people don't know that there are castles all throughout Ethiopia. We never see that on television. We always see the cats and the dudes in the mud huts and people starving in Ethiopia, but there are very well designed castles all over Ethiopia. And a lot of the Moors, you can see pictures and paintings of them in castles in Europe. You can look at old paintings and see this.
What you are looking at when you see the cathedrals, that's all Moorish architecture, taken to the next level. In fact, we know for a fact, and I have to get the specific book once more, but all of the cathedrals that you see built in England, the island of England, were built by the Moors.
By the time the Moors got into Europe, the illiteracy rate was very high because there was no practical reason for people to read at the time, because people were really trying to survive. So the only people who could read at the time were monks or religious figures. So the Moors went into Europe and they started to establish universities.
The first university created in Europe, the University of Salamanca. They created the education system that Europe adopted. They brought in what became classical music. They're the ones who brought architecture and fineries. In fact, it was so advanced that the teachers in the Moorish paradigm in the Iberian Peninsula, the teachers under the Moors got the equivalent of $40,000 a year back then. That's how advanced they were. In fact, everywhere in Europe sent their best to go and learn there, just like they sent them to Timbuktu, just like they sent them over to Luxor, just like they sent them over to where all these areas where you see Africans and high sciences were, they sent them there to Spain to learn.
Well, the Moors brought in the first music conservatory into Valencia, Spain. They brought Ziryab into Spain, and he brought in a chordophone known as the lute. L'-O-U-D. We call it lute, L-U-T-E. It's a chordophone. And it has 4 chords. And, you know, the hormones of the body, the humors, Africans would heal people when you had clogs in your liquid systems, okay? Whether it was your mucus or whether it was your hormones, whether it was your phlegm, whether it was your blood. Whatever was clogged up, what they do is that they would put this chordophone over your body and they would strum, right? And in strumming, the vibration of the string would open up whatever was clogged, okay? Ziryab, in his brilliance, added a 5th string. And his 5th string was for plasma, which is invisible liquid, which is the origin of the universe. And this just healed your entire system, your entire body. When you look at a piano is a harp turned sideways. That's why when you look at a baby grand piano, it's shaped like a harp. Then you take the top up and you put a stick there so that it's open, right? So that Africans said that instead of strumming strings to make the sound, what they would do is they would put it to its side, encase it in wood, and then you would hit keys. And the keys then would hit the strings and it would be a different kind of sound. And so when you're looking at Baroque music, which Bach is really given credit for developing, that came out of Africa. Okay, Africa. In fact, Africans have the finger piano that they play. All they did was take the concept of the finger piano, the xylophone, and this harp turned sideways, and that became piano. Out of that came what we call classical music, and this is why when I hear African folk talk about, because I enjoy classical music. I play classical music, I enjoy listening to classical music, but that's black music, that's soul music. And black folk used classical music as soul music, but Europeans took it. And so now when we look at what we call classical music, Tchaikovsky, or Beethoven, or Mozart, or any of the so-called classical pianists or classical musicians, we say, oh man, that's white music. That's not white music. We don't know our history.
Clearly Africa. One of the most famous Hawaiians is a guy named Duke Kahanamoku. Duke was one of the forefathers of modern surfing.
and they would use Duke to promote tourism in Hawaii. They would send Duke to the continental United States to promote swimming in Hawaii and surfing, and Duke had problems getting into swimming areas when he came to the continental U.S. because people thought that he was black because he was so dark. And many of the native Hawaiians, they have that dark African phenotype. If you go to places like Maui and some of the remote areas of Hawaii, they look like black people, just like Samoans. You go to Samoa, they look like black people over here in America.
I'm doing an interview, a call-in thing, and somebody called in and says, you know, I'm a Hawaiian. And he says, the problem was you just didn't meet the right people. I said, really? He says, when I was a young boy, my grandmother used to tell me that when Kamehameha was trying to unite the Hawaiian Islands, this is around 1815, that he ran into trouble and he sent back to Africa for reinforcements. He said that was a Hawaiian tradition.
African people, they've been coming to the Americas for years, thousands of years before Europeans. And this is why many Europeans knew how to get over to the Americas based on maps that African people left for centuries.
We wear the gene pool of the Native American population. We wear the gene pool of the African, which is called Moors, who had preceded Columbus to this country. And we wear the gene pool of those Africans who came from the continent. And so we felt that this land, and I do now still feel this land is ours. I'm an African American. Africa is my race. America is my geopolitical place. I'm not surrendering that to anybody.
One of the things we know is there are Europeans who wrote books about the African presence in America before Columbus, but it's difficult to actually get your hands on some of the copies of these books. They're real hard to find because it wasn't popular for white folk or black folk, but especially white scientists, to say that African folk, that Moorish people were in America prior to the European coming here.
There are three belts that leave the coast of Africa. There's one that's in the north, there's one in the middle, and there's one in the south. When you look at this middle one literally will take you right into the Gulf of Mexico, even if you didn't have power boat. And what's going to happen is the Africans are going to start to move into this area here, and they're going to begin to settle in this corner of the Gulf of Mexico. They're going to develop, according to what our research shows, three major cities: Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo, okay, and La Venta.
If you go to Mexico, southern Mexico now, especially in the provinces and towns in southwest Mexico, they'll tell you there's two black people there. The ones that came on the ship, meaning those who were enslaved, and the ones who came before the ship, meaning those like the Olmecs and others who had been here at a point where no one knows when that genesis was. They just were always here.
The Olmec problem was that European scientists, after finding it, it was found by a little farmer who was clearing the land for him to grow some maize and grow his corn. And he found what looked like an upside down pot. And when he called the owner of the land over, they found out what it was, and he excavated it, and they found this gigantic head. Now that was back early in 1837 or 1897 or something around that time. When they found that and they saw this Africoid face, that completely turned everything around, because they thought the Mayan civilization was the oldest civilization here. Now, when they found that the Mayan civilization was not the oldest civilization, and that Africans all through the histories were supposedly brought here as slaves, they did not want to fess up and change their whole curriculum to state that there was an African civilization in the Americas some 5,000, 10,000 years ago. The other part of it is that during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, the Vatican put out an edict very quietly that all Western books and academia had to first be passed through the Vatican census. So the Vatican said that any evidence of black history here had to be taken off of the history book.
Here in Mexico, I saw one Olmec statue. It was very interesting to me. It had the face of an African person, and the name of the statue was actually called Monkey Looking in the Sky. And what they would do, they would try to pretend that a lot of these statues were actually animals. Like the Olmec heads, they would try to say that they were jaguars or they were aliens from outer space. The European archaeologists would try to make up anything to say that they were not black. But this one statue called Monkey Looking in the Sky is clearly not a monkey, because first of all, monkeys don't have full lips and it looks like a person. It is a person. And this just goes to show the depths that these archaeologists will go to deny the African history.
One of the earliest groups that I can find archaeologically would be the Folsom people, Folsom. That's why you go out, you look at your map, you find various areas that we call the Folsom areas, Folsom, Arizona, Folsom, Nevada. You go out in New Mexico, find Folsom Prison, and you find one, and one of the biggest archaeological and oldest digs in America is called the Folsom Archaeological Findings out there, where they found all these African artifacts in the ground. And that was 16,000 years ago. 6,000 years ago, Asians began to migrate across the Bering Straits into the United States, and they came into the United States across the Bering Straits into Canada, then down to the northern part of the United States, and down into the southern part, and they interbred and met and interbred with blacks, those Folsom people. And otherwise, that's why American Indians never had slant eyes and were never yellow skinned. They became round-eyed and brown skin and red skin.
All over the country of Costa Rica, you have these little African-like statues just all over the place. And when you go to the museums, you see these African artifacts, African-style gold, a lot of monuments and artifacts that resemble monuments and artifacts from West Africa.
You have one part of the Mississippi River go one way, the other part goes the other way. In the Y of that split, you have a place that Native Americans call Cahokia. Today it's called Collinsville, Illinois. It's near St. Louis. This is where you have the largest pyramid in the Northern Hemisphere. It's called Monk's Mound.
If you look at pictures from the 1900s and beyond, most of the Native American people were very dark-skinned. Sometimes they were very jet black. But most Native American people before 1900, if you look at photos of them, they're extremely dark-skinned people, especially on the West Coast, like in California. The California Indians were very dark-skinned. The Indians that were around the Minnesota and Milwaukee area that we know as Milwaukee and Minnesota now, they were very dark-skinned people. The Native Americans on the East Coast were very dark-skinned people. In the late 1800s, there was something called the Dawes Rolls, which was basically a census that made records of people's ethnic backgrounds in order to determine which Native American tribes would get certain land allotments and other benefits. After slavery, many black people were associated with some of these tribes by bloodline, through marriage, through adoption, and even servitude. And because they were associated with these tribes, many black people were entitled to some of these benefits. The government did not want blacks to get these benefits, so they created a separate freedmen's list specifically for black people. They also started to list any full-blooded Native American who had African features as black because they didn't want them getting those benefits either. At the same time, they allowed white citizens to come in and pay money under the table to be listed as part Native American.
1895 and 1896, when a lot of the whites found out the benefits that these blacks are going to be entitled to, a lot of whites went to the Dawes Commission and say, look, why don't you put my name on there? They said, but you're not an Indian. So that's what they said, well, I'll give you $5. So the rule got around, the policy got around that for $5 that a white could put his name on the Dawes rolls and be called himself an Indian and be entitled to all these benefits, and all their children could be entitled to all these benefits forever. And so that became known as what's called a $5 Indian. And so if you go around now and check most of the Indians, the so-called Indians in America, about 90% of them are not even Indians. Those are just whites now who are passing as Indians. But they're getting all the benefits. And they're not paying any taxes, getting free college education. They put up a little reservation on the land that they don't live on. They have another home off and get all kind of benefits.
Iron Eyes Cody was another famous Native American person, He was in the media for years. In the 1970s, they utilized him for this pollution commercial. He was known as the Crying Indian. So he was a very well-known Native American in American culture. But the reality is, Iron Eyes Cody wasn't Native American at all. He was Sicilian. Both of his parents were from Sicily. So he didn't have one drop of Native American blood in him. He was another fake Indian. First authorized paintings from the Americas was of these 3 African men who were the leaders of a maroon colony down in Central America. And these men, the legend is that they were enslaved Africans who escaped and they were shipwrecked, and they formed a maroon colony down in Central America, and they became leaders of the Native American tribes down in Central America. And this painting of these 3 African men, it's at a museum in Madrid, Spain today.
Boukman, Haitian Revolution, the original revolutionary, because he was turned in the night of the revolution. That's when Toussaint Louverture took over. The book Irritated Genie, we need to read. His name was Boukman. Boukman was called Boukman from Jamaica because he couldn't be handled in Jamaica. He was sold to Haiti. He started a rebellion amongst the African people. And they knew him as Boukman because they always read. He was very intelligent. He always taught the people who they were and what they were. The night before the revolution, Boukman looked to his brothers and sisters in the field. And he said, you want to win? Cast aside your white God. Embrace your African spirit. You are free. He didn't say you will be free. He didn't say you can be free. He didn't say you could be free. He said, cast aside your white God. You are free.
Had it not been for the Haitian Revolution, America would be 50% of its current size, if not more. The Louisiana Purchase doubled America's size, and there would have never been a Louisiana Purchase if there had never been a Boukman Dada, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Toussaint Louverture, because it was their victory over Napoleon's army that bankrupted the banks of France and forced them to sell its shares of land in America to this country.
Toussaint Louverture gave millions of dollars to a man named Stephen Girard. He was a European sea captain. And Toussaint Louverture gave him this money to get arms because they were going to set up a colony in Africa to fight slavery. And when Toussaint Louverture went to prison, Stephen Girard would not return the money to Toussaint Louverture and his descendants and his family. So Stephen Girard took the money, the millions of dollars that he got from Toussaint Louverture, came to America, started Girard College, and he really became the first American millionaire. And so a lot of people don't know that Girard College was founded on stolen money from Toussaint Louverture. The HMS Challenger was a ship that went on an expedition in the 1870s. And they went to different places around the world. And one of the places they went to was a place down in South America called Terra del Fuego. It's right on the tip of South America. And they took photographs of some of the Native American people there. And one of the Native Americans down there, one of the Native American pictures they took is a man who looks like a West African man. He's pure Native American though. And this picture of this Native American man who looks like a West African, this photograph is at the London Museum to this day.
Black history is taught like this. You started off as a slave, then white folks felt bad and decided to free you. Then civil rights legislation made you equal. And finally, you achieved victory with Obama's election. The end. Of course, that is ridiculous. That is the white supremacist version of Black history. The end result of this miseducation is that Black children are separated from their own people's legacy and historical achievements. Everybody in the world has the right to draw inspiration from their own people's legacy. And this right is robbed from Black children because their history is actively hidden, distorted, and replaced with make-believe. For this video, we will carefully cover the facts on how Black people became liberated from American chattel slavery. The miseducational system has taught us 3 gigantic myths about the freeing of the slaves. The first myth is that there was only some slave rebellions here and there, but not any kind of large-scale military resistance to slavery initiated and carried out by black men. The second myth is that any slaves who wanted freedom basically fled north to be granted freedom. The third myth is that the Civil War was the primary event that ended chattel slavery. The reality is that there was a series of battles, revolts, and rebellions that lasted from 1739 to 1858. This was the Gullah Wars. That is more than 100 years of warfare totally hidden from the American history books. A lot of this history was disguised as the Seminole Wars. First of all, the Seminoles were not a real Native American tribe. They were Native Americans allied with and often led by black Africans. Seminole literally means runaway. Maroon means fugitive. Gullah refers to the black Africans. The Emancipation Proclamation was a staged event, and it was designed to stop and historically hide the self-liberation process of Africans in America. Africans were brought into the Anglo-American New World Order, and many of these Africans maintained the goal to kill, crush, and destroy white supremacy. 1739, the Gullah War begins. Carolina was about to pass the Security Act, which would require whites to be armed more often to prevent a slave uprising. So the slaves decided that this was the time to strike. About 20 of them went to the local store, stocked up on guns and ammo, killed the shopkeeper, and began the Stono Rebellion. The rebels marched, and as they marched, their following grew larger and larger. They chanted out liberty as they marched, chasing the slave owners, killing them, and burning their houses down. After the rebellion, South Carolina passed the Negro Act, which prevented a future rebellion by limiting the rights of the slaves. From that point in time until 1812, the Gullah were fighting continuous battles against the state militia in Florida. Spain was fighting against the American colonists for land in Florida. The Spanish started arming the Gullah and providing them with military training. The Gullah used this military equipment and training to defend their own free, independent black towns. The first black town in North America was called Garcia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. It was built by the black man and officially recognized later by the Spanish Lieutenant General Montillano in 1738. This black town was a place that slaves could escape to have their own land and receive military training. 1814, Andrew Jackson defeated the Native American Creek Confederation. He imposed on them the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which basically stole their land. So Chief Sakafoka led thousands of his warriors to Florida and joined forces with the mighty Gullah Nation. The so-called Indian Wars were actually the Gullah Wars. General Thomas Jessup said, "Throughout my operations, I found the Negroes the most active and determined warriors, and during the conferences with the Indian chief, I ascertained that they exercised an almost controlling influence over them. This, you may be assured, is a Negro and not an Indian war." 1816, the Battle of Negro Fort. Negro Fort was a structure built by the British and occupied and led by black Gullahs. Andrew Jackson ordered Colonel Clinch to destroy Negro Fort. After they destroyed Negro Fort, Andrew Jackson ordered the torture of the leaders and the enslavement of the black captives. This was a historical turning point in Gullah military strategy. The Gullah leaders who escaped decided that they would never again use the British strategy of fighting from a fixed fortified position. They decided instead that they would return to using the traditional Gullah method of guerrilla warfare, which involved striking and vanishing, luring the enemy into strange areas. The forest, the pasture, the swamp. They had the advantage with decentralized warfare because they knew the land better. As more and more slaves, the mighty Gullah nation. The so-called Indian Wars were actually the Gullah Wars. General Thomas Jessup said, "Throughout my operations, I found the Negroes the most active and determined warriors, and during the conferences with the Indian chief, I ascertained that they exercised an almost controlling influence over them. This, you may be assured, is a Negro and not an Indian war." 1816, the Battle of Negro Fort. Negro Fort was a structure built by the British and occupied and led by black Gullahs. Andrew Jackson ordered Colonel Clinch to destroy Negro Fort. After they destroyed Negro Fort, Andrew Jackson ordered the torture of the leaders, the enslavement of the black captives. This was a historical turning point in Gullah military strategy. The Gullah leaders who escaped decided that they would never again use the British strategy of fighting from a fixed fortified position. They decided instead that they would return to using the traditional Gullah method of guerrilla warfare, which involved striking and vanishing, luring the enemy into strange areas. The forest, the pasture, the swamp. They had the advantage with decentralized warfare because they knew the land better. As more and more slaves fled south for freedom, thousands of U.S. soldiers died at the hands of the superior Gullah warriors. 1818, the Battle of Suwanee. A stretch of towns along the Suwanee River was occupied by a series of self-sufficient Native American and Gullah colonies. Once again, General Andrew Jackson came to terrorize and invade them. The Gullah and the Native American warriors, allied in the swamps, inflicted heavy damage on the invading army. Andrew Jackson was defeated by the Gullahs, however, he fraudulently claimed the battle as a victory. After the Gullah warriors and their allies disappeared into the swamps, Andrew Jackson exacted revenge against them by slaughtering a nearby settlement of their women and children. The killing of women and children was the only victory Andrew Jackson achieved in the Battle of Suwanee. This black history was actively hidden. Whenever the word black or Negro or African were mentioned in war reports, the words were simply omitted or replaced with an asterisk. The Gullah Wars were also hidden from the newspapers so they wouldn't scare away potential European settlers. Real American history shows that the black man was destroying the institution of slavery. 1822. The resistance had grown completely out of control of the United States government. In Charleston, South Carolina, almost all the slaves in the area had joined a movement to carry out a massive slave revolt. What white people had not considered is that every time you capture a free Gullah warrior and sell him into slavery, the Gullah warrior will only spread his own knowledge amongst the new slaves he's living with. This rebellion was to be led by Denmark Vesey and his lieutenant Peter Poyas. 9,000 slaves were planning to revolt that day. However, the revolt never actually took place because cowardly black people involved with the movement informed the white colonists of these plans. Everyone involved ended up being executed or sold away to another plantation. 1835, the victory over the King Fort Relief, otherwise known as the Dade Massacre. The reason it was recorded as a massacre instead of a battle was to hide the fact that it was a legitimate military victory for the Black Gullah. Also in 1835, the U.S. Army suffered another defeat at the Withlacoochee River, forcing General Gaines to leave Florida. 1837, Colonel Taylor claimed the Battle of Lake Okeechobee as a victory for the United States. In reality, the Gullah warriors and the Native Americans had already started fleeing the area and spreading the Gullah resistance victory for the United States. In reality, the Gullah warriors and the Native Americans had already started fleeing the area and spreading the Gullah resistance to other parts of America. The real war that ended slavery was not the Civil War, it was the Gullah Wars. It was Native Americans and black Muslim Gullahs against the white Christian colonists. The so-called Civil War was carried out for elitist banking and business interests, and it also served as a formality, a ceremonial ending to chattel slavery. In reality, slavery ended in America because it couldn't be maintained against the constant guerrilla attacks, and the only way to stop those attacks was to make slavery illegal. The free black man would not tolerate slavery. Therefore, it came to an end.
So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, another hidden war that we actually...
Black history is taught like this. You started off as a slave, then white folks felt bad and decided to free you. Then civil rights legislation made you equal. And finally, you achieved victory with Obama's election. The end. Of course, that is ridiculous. That is the white supremacist version of black history. The end result of this miseducation